My name is Dr. Paul Elliott, and I'm the admissions tutor for the sciences here at Homerton. And I'm going to be taking you through some of the things that we look for in applicants during interviews. And I know interviews can be very, very scary, but a good interview is actually something where you have a kind of bit of a chat, really, a bit of a discussion about really interesting bits of science. And a good interview is one where you'll end up thinking a lot more about some of the topics you've maybe been studying at school. And also, it's a situation where we can give you guidance as well. And so if you think about it, if you're doing assessments as part of your A-levels or equivalents, or if you're doing some of our admissions assessments, you can't get feedback and you can't get guidance. But in an interview, actually, we can give you pointers and directions to get you on the route to the right answer. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly, and bear with me for 1 second.
Just to let you know, Paul,
Yeah.
I can moderate the questions, but I can actually accept them, and then that means that you can also see them. Or if you don't want to log on to Slido because it's an additional window, I can just read them out to you.
Okay, if you can read them out to me, that would be quite useful.
Okay, would you like to do that at the end?
We can do that at the end, absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, can you see my screen, Lindsay? Are we all
Yeah.
ready to go? Okay, good. We got there eventually after a few bumps along the way. So, okay, what do we look for in interviews? Well, have a look at this triangle that you can see on the screen. And this is called Bloom's taxonomy for thinking. And it's basically a summary of the different ways in which people can think. And in interviews, we look for particular types of thinking. So this triangle is kind of a hierarchy where as you move up the triangle, everything becomes a bit more difficult. So at the bottom, you've got knowledge. Now, you do need knowledge for interviews. So you need to be able to recall some of the things that you've learned in your A-levels or equivalent. But we kind of expect that when you come to the interview. What we actually start to look for, though, is a proper comprehension or understanding of the materials that you've been taught. So your interviewers will be quite good at actually pushing you to think about that material. It's not just a case of regurgitating what you know. It's a case of us seeing if you fully understand some of that information. So many of our questions will actually push you to think about the material you've learned in different ways than you perhaps had before. Many of our interviews will also focus on you applying your knowledge in new situations. So many interviews will be based upon us giving you an object, or it might be an equation, or a graph, or a picture, or in some of the art subjects, you might get a passage of text. And we'll be asking you to take what you know to answer questions about that object, equation, graph, or passage. So you'll be using what you know to think about this new material in a different way. And that can seem quite scary at first because you'll be asked questions about things that you haven't really thought about before, a different type of graph. But remember, we're not assessing you on what you know. It's about how you can apply understanding to these new situations. Now, in many science interviews, we'll also ask you to analyze something. And quite frequently in a science interview, you might need to analyze a diagram. So, for instance, if you're applying for physics or engineering, there'll often be things like sliding block puzzles where you have to work out the kind of masses and where all the forces can be resolved. In biology, you might be given a graph to analyze, and you might have to read some data off of the graph and interpret what it means. So analysis is often very important in science interviews. Now, we're getting very high up this taxonomy of thinking now, And so we're now on to synthesis. And this is about putting things together. Now, I'll talk about exact aspects of interviews later, but many of the interviews will involve two interviewers for about half an hour or so, 25 minutes, half an hour. And each interviewer will often ask you maybe 10 or 15 minutes worth of questions, many of which are connected to each other. And what we often look for is your ability to put together these different ideas that come out of each of our different questions. So, for instance, I can tell you what I asked in the last interview round. I asked questions about the evolution of angiosperms, about the evolution of flowering plants. And many students hadn't really hadn't really experienced this kind of question before. And I asked about why it was that flowering plants evolved so quickly compared to other types of plants. And I wasn't really expecting any kind of, real knowledge prior to the question, but I wanted to see how people could think. And so then during the interview questions across the 10 minutes or 15 minutes, I would give people pictures of different types of flower and different types of pollinator to see if they could pick up on the fact that there are many different types of flowering plant because there are many different types of pollinator. And over evolutionary time, these pollinators have adapted to the different types of flower to become better at getting pollen or nectar. And also the flowers have adapted to attracting specific types of insects so that their pollen can be transferred more directly to another plant of the same species. And I would build up this question. So I give them little bits of information. And I was really looking to see how students could bring together this information to come up with an answer. All the information that was needed to answer the question was actually in my line of questioning, but students needed to put the information together to get to the answer. And so this synthesis is often something that we do. And in many cases during science interviews, we'll ask students to bring together different bits of the interview, normally at the end of the interview, to see if they can really integrate everything that they will have learned during the interview itself. And then finally at the top is evaluation. This is like the hardest thing to do. This is the ability to judge a piece of work or some answers, to be able to take all the information together that you've received, to put it together, but then to come up with a conclusion about that information. Now, that's really tough. We often don't get to do that fully in interviews, but occasionally we might ask you what your thoughts are on the most likely answer to a particular question. So hopefully that gives you an idea, first of all, before we get into any of the kind of detail about interview, about the kind of thinking that we're looking for. And remember, this type of thinking is particularly well assessed during interviews. It's difficult to do when you're looking at just basic multiple choice questions, or if you're looking at sort of written work, because we can't give you information to help guide you along your way. And so interviews are a great way of us assessing these types of skills. It should also be noted that these types of skills are the ones which you will use in our supervision system. And I know Lindsay has probably talked about our supervision system at Cambridge and about how every week you sit down, just a small group of students and an academic, and you discuss the supervisions in depth. So we discuss the lectures in depth. And really what we're doing partly here is seeing how well you would cope with those types of supervision style teaching sessions. So that's a kind of broad overview of the type of thinking that we look for in interviews. Now, a few more specific points now. So interviews will be tough. They will, particularly well, I wouldn't say particularly in STEM, but in the sciences, they will be hard. And you will face challenging questions that you won't have encountered before. So they will be focused and they will push you to think about material. And as I mentioned before, often you'll be thinking about new things, objects, new graphs, new equations that you haven't encountered before. And you'll be using the existing knowledge that you have to try and answer those questions. On top of that, and this is really important, again, to note, that we can give you hints. As an interviewer, I've probably interviewed maybe a couple of thousand students over the years. And in every single interview that I've given, I have given hints to students. I've given guidance. I've prompted students to get them onto the right track. And it's absolutely fine to get things wrong. That's absolutely fine. That happens in every interview. Again, in every interview I've done, I think students have got things wrong. But we will give you guidance to get you back onto the right track. And that is a really important thing to remember. Because I've had students in interviews who got like one question wrong. And then you could see it clearly quite upset them, even though I'd maybe like already decided that they were doing really, really well. And so we will give you guidance, and how you use that guidance is really quite interesting, because it's really important that you listen to what we tell you. Your interviewer is there to give you prompts and listen to what your interviewer says, because they can guide you onto the right route. Some of the less good interviews that I've done have been where students didn't listen to anything I said. And they would keep on going down a line of argument that they got stuck on. They just couldn't move away from it, despite me giving them the guidance to put them in the right direction. So you've got to be able to listen to your interviewer and take on board the hints that they give. So what do we cover in general? Well, most of the time we cover the stuff you've been doing in your previous courses, in your academic work. Sometimes we might touch upon subject-related wider awareness. So some of the things you might have been reading in the news, or maybe occasionally things that you put in your personal statement. Particularly as parts of the warm-up, we might ask you about your personal statement. But most of the time in the sciences, there will be some form of prompt material. Again, in the form of a graph, an equation, a picture, something like that, to start you off. And it's really important to remember that there's no hidden agenda. There are no trick questions. And importantly, they are not the final hurdle. And again, I know that Lindsay will have already talked about some of the things that we look for in your broader applications. And the interviews are just part of that. They are not this final hurdle to get over. What happens after the interviews is myself as an admissions tutor will sit down with all of the directors of studies involved in your interviews and all of the interviewers, and we'll discuss each application as a whole. So we will look at your performance in the admissions assessment. We'll look at your personal statement, at your reference, at your previous grades, and we'll look at the interview alongside those to come up with a decision about whether we think you would do well here and whether we would like to make you an offer. So it's about the interview being part of our holistic assessment of you as an applicant. So that's some broad kind of advice, well, some broad summaries of what the interviews are. In terms of practically, the interviews typically last between 20 and 45 minutes. At Homerton, we give 2 interviews, which will last around about 25 minutes each, normally. And in each of those interviews, you will have 2 interviewers who will be asking you different questions. Remember, it's about problem solving, about answering questions, often about objects and items, and discussion. And we will be moving around the topic. Sometimes interviews can go in different directions for one student than they do for another. So there is an element of discussion as well, where the answers that you give may dictate where your interview goes later on. Now, the format of them, I can't tell you absolutely for sure what the format of the interviews will be. And what I mean by this is whether they will be online or in person. What I can say is that last year at Cambridge, the vast majority of interviews were online. And I think every college apart from 5 did online interviews for both their home and for their overseas students. A few colleges, I think it was 5, did in-person interviews for their home students. Homerton wasn't one of those. We did online interviews for everyone. We are not quite there yet in publishing exactly what formats the interviews will be in, but what I probably can say is that in all likelihood, many or most or all of our science interviews are likely to be online here at Homerton. I can't speak for other colleges, but that is just a provisional summary of what's happening. What's happening at the moment is all of the colleges are discussing things, and we should have a decision, I think, probably in about a month's time. So watch this space regarding what format the interviews will be in eventually. Okay, so remember, the interviews are an interactive assessment of, yes, your understanding and your thinking skills. We also get a bit of an idea about your interest in the subject as well, although we don't really assess enthusiasm because it's very easy to be enthusiastic in some respects, but we will be able to assess your motivation. So, whether you like the subject. We are assessing your aptitude. We will judge, we will look at your core knowledge because that is the basis on which many of our questions are being asked. But remember, the last 2 here are really important. We're also looking for your ability to learn from mistakes and how you take on board the hints and guidance that we give to rectify some of those mistakes. And remember, we also look at your ability to listen. Okay, it's really, really important that you listen. I can't reiterate this enough. Listen, listen, listen to what your interviewer says, and they will give you guidance. If you get stuck, it's okay to ask for a bit of guidance or a pointer. That's absolutely fine. Although, don't do it too quickly. Don't sort of get asked the question and then a second later say, no, I don't know, give me some advice. You've got to think about it and only then ask for guidance if you really are stuck. Good. Now, so those are what the basics of the interview. So I want to take you through a few different types of interview questions. And perhaps, Lindsay, actually, you can tell me if anyone can give me the answers to this through the Slido. Can students just type in the number that they think it might be?
Yes, so just a reminder to go to slido.com and put in the word Homerton so that you can interact. Okay, so this is a question, you won't be asked this now, but this was asked maybe 10, 15 years ago at interview. It's one of my favourites because it's quite a simple one to get into. There's quite a few responses already. Okay, what answers have people given so far? We've got 64, 8 times 8 board. We've got 100, and then we've got 2 other 64. Oh, okay. And 2 more, 65, 64, another 64. Another 64. So people are going for 64. Okay, just bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to grab a prop, and I'm just got caught up in my headphones. Bear with me for 1 second. Another 64. Somebody says way more. Okay, way more coming now. So, chessboard. Somebody says it depends which chessboard. Oh, I didn't know there was some really good ones. It's interesting. Okay. Could be 128 because there are 2 sides, somebody says. Oh, some interesting answers here. So, people have given me 64. Okay, that's a good answer. That's what most people say, first of all.
So 64 is 8 times 8. So it's the number of 1 by 1 squares. Okay. Now, just me saying that might make you suddenly think, okay, he said that there are 1 by 1 squares. So what other types of square can there be? So what other types of square can there be? Lindsay, what do you think?
Sorry, I was looking through the slide.
Yeah. So what other types of square could there be?
As
Apart
well
from
as
1 by 1 squares, just a small square.
Oh, 2 by 2. Oh, somebody
2 by 2.
says you can make more squares 2 by 2.
And 3 by 3. And 4 by 4. And 5 by 5. And 6 by 6. And 7 by... So already, and then students are thinking, oh my God, this is hard for
Somebody says, yeah, 2 by 2, 3 times 3, 4 times 4,
Absolutely.
5 times 5.
So here's where we start looking at sort of more discrete patterns. So again, as an interviewer, I'd say, okay, how many 2 by 2 squares are there on a chessboard? How many 2 by 2 squares? Probably see it unless it is. How many 2 by 2 squares? It's going all faded.
I'm just waiting for some responses. So are there infinite possibilities? Somebody says. Somebody else says 16. I think that's
16 is what the students often say. So what the student has done there is they've said that there's one there, but it's all disappearing once my finger goes. There's one there. So there's one there, there's one there. That's
yeah, it's
4 by
disappearing
4.
because your background is blurred.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, it's
some...
better here if it's on my body. Look. So you're right. So the student has said, look, there's one there, there's one there, there's one there, and there's one there. So there's 4 across, 4 down, so that's 16. But if you think about it, there is a square here, but there's also a square here.
Somebody else said, sorry, does the chessboard itself count as a square?
We'll get to that eventually. Yeah.
What about the outline around the mini squares? And somebody else says, what units?
We'll get to the outer squares later, but we're just working through systematically. So can anyone tell me how many 2 by 2 squares there are?
Somebody else says 204 squares total.
That is the absolute answer. That is the answer. But if we just, we're going to work out how we get to that. So how many 2 by 2 squares are there, first of all? So think about it. There was one there, and then you shift across one, you get another 2 by 2. You shift across another one, and get another 2 by 2. So how many 2 by 2 squares are there?
Somebody says 25.
No. So actually, there are 7 along the top, because if you think about it, you know, the first one is 2 squares together. And then if you count along, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So there's 7 along and 7 down. So how many?
Someone says 48. Somebody else says 49.
Close. It's 49. Yeah, 49. So there's
someone
49.
Someone says you can use square numbers, and somebody else says that would add up to 204.
Absolutely. So the next step for those of you who want to go through entirely, in terms of 3 by 3 squares, there's 1 there, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 6 by 6. Now at this point, you've got the number of 1 by 1 squares being 8 times 8, or 8 squared. Number of 2 by 2 squares being 7 squared. The number of 3 by 3 squares being 6 squared. So what's the number of 4 by 4 squared? It's going to be 5 squared. And the number of 5 by 5 squares will be 4 squared. So it's the sum of all of the squares up to 8. And that will give you the answer of 204. Now, of course, if you want to count the outer one, I'll let you get away with 205 as well. But can you see that that question, no matter how simple it seems at first, requires you to think about this board in a fair amount of detail, and it requires you to think of patterns. And many of our mathematics type questions and engineering questions will often be about pattern spotting and about trying to create equations that actually relate to a kind of problem in the real world or in a hypothetical world. So that's one question. I started with that one because that's one of my favorite questions ever. Let's move on to a slightly different question, now based upon a graph. So this is a question that could be asked to someone who is applying for biological natural sciences. It could theoretically be something in medicine. It could certainly be a question that came up for psychological and behavioral sciences, because this is really about brains and animals. And it's about graphical interpretation.
Just quickly, for those that are submitting questions that are not directly linked to what we're looking at right now, I'll leave those till the end for Paul to reply. I'm not ignoring them.
Okay, good. So we're going to move through a few more questions, and then we'll come to questions right at the end. Yeah. So this is a graph which I've actually done some teaching on. And my first question to you would be, what do you think it shows? So this is a graph of brain weight versus body weight. So it shows really how the weight of the brain compares to the weight of the body for a number of different animals. And I might ask you, just to test a little bit of knowledge, like what types of animals are shown on this diagram? Does anyone know? What are all of these animals?
Don't have any responses yet. Oh, mammals.
They are all mammals, absolutely. And I might ask you just quickly, so what makes something a mammal? And it's basically the ability to lactate. And some students would say it's about giving birth to live young, and I question that, because some mammals don't give birth to live young. Some might say about hair, but not all mammals have hair, strictly speaking, across their lifetime. But the lactation, the production of milk, is something that they will do. So, and I'd ask them to sort of tell me what they think it shows. And some students might say that it shows that there are certain animals, certain mammals, that have very big brains. And what I would do is I'd say, what do you think it means if an animal, a mammal on this diagram, lies above this line of best fit that runs through the center of this diagram? So for something like the dolphin, what do you think it means if their point is well above this line of best fit? So what does it mean? How would you interpret that biologically? Any ideas?
Tends to take a while for things. Someone says it has a larger capability to process information. There's another comment, it has a higher brain weight than body weight compared to the average mammal.
Yeah. So sometimes students will say, oh, it's definitely more intelligent. And then we would talk about what intelligent was.
Their body weight implies a particular brain mass, but the animal actually has a brain mass above that. It's effectively smarter than it should be. Somebody else says it doesn't follow a general pattern. Maybe there's anomaly or greater variety. Someone else says their brain makes up more of their total weight.
Yeah.
Somebody else says environment maybe need more adaptability, which requires more intelligence. Someone says their brain weight is greater than the average for that body weight.
Yeah, so you need to be slightly careful about going too far in what you infer, but certainly the animals seem to be devoting a lot more energy into creating a big brain for their body size. And we might get into the idea of intelligence in a little bit of detail, depending upon how long we've got in the interview. What I would also then do is almost every science question will have some form of calculation. And my favorite calculation would be something like, can you estimate for me the brain to body weight ratio of the rhesus monkey? The question is, what would be the brain to body weight ratio of the rhesus monkey? This is a bit tougher now.
There's another thing that came in, I think, before you asked that question. Yeah. Dolphins and bats both use echolocation, which requires more energy in terms of brain activity, but they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. There's a question mark there, so it might be they're asking a question.
That's true. That's true. We can come back to that later. That's a good question, actually. So what would be the brain to body weight ratio of the rhesus monkey, first of all?
don't have any responses. Oh, there's one. 1 to 5.
1 to 5. Okay. Any other?
Not yet any others, but sometimes it takes a bit of time for it to. Oh, there's another one. 1 to 10.
Okay. Let's just go through this. So I've been really mean on this question because actually I've removed some of the
1 to 50.
values on the axes. So the first thing you need to do is work out what kind of axes they are. If you look very carefully, hopefully you can see that they are actually log scales. So each of these units, each of these intervening gaps here basically represents being multiplied 100 times. So this point on the graph, can you see my arrow, Lindsay?
Yes.
Yes, good. So this point on the graph will be 100 kilograms. And so this point, roughly where the rhesus monkey is, will be around about 10 kilograms. Okay. Then if you look along here, this is between 10 and 1,000. So this point here will be 100 grams. So the rhesus monkey is roughly 100 to 10. Now, I've purposely not included units there because almost everyone says, oh, it's 100 to 10. I'm like, oh, but what about the units? Okay. So it's kilograms. So it's basically 100 grams to 10,000 grams. So that ends up as being 1 to 100, roughly. That makes sense?
Don't think anyone said that. We had 1 to 50, 15 to 1.
But that's okay, because the whole point is that in an interview, the interview will guide you through it. And I would say, so what value is this here? And then what value is this? And then what value is this? And then I'll get given the wrong answer and say, look at the units. And believe it or not, in that natural sciences interviews, units are often pop up as part of the question, because it's astonishing how many students can get units wrong. And so often we will ask you to calculate a kind of length or a width or some kind of scaling relationship, because it actually gives us a good idea of how you can manipulate numbers. So there will be calculations in almost every science type interview.
Someone says,
oh, sorry.
Someone says, this is not an answer, but I dislike the measurements.
It is a bit weird, yeah. But this is actually taken from a graph in a book, but I just removed a couple of things just so I could actually ask people about it. It is a bit strange. The last question would be about this red dot here. Now, I've actually put an animal on this graph that is not a mammal. And so I'm interested to know what this animal could be. It's not a mammal. It is an animal, but it's not a mammal. What could it be? Any ideas? So it's an animal, but not a mammal.
A magpie. Somebody else says a frog. An amphibian, a crow.
It is actually a crow, but a magpie is just as good an answer because a magpie is a type of crow. It's part of the corvid family. And it is a crow. And crows are incredibly intelligent birds. There's been lots of studies of them at Cambridge, actually, about their great abilities in terms of memorization and in terms of understanding relationships within groups. And we'd talk about a bit more about intelligence then and how you might assess the intelligence of a crow. Because at the end of the day, crows don't have the same kind of abilities to manipulate things that we do, just have a beak. And so we've devised some tests together to think about how you would assess a crow's intelligence. You can see here, can you see that there's lots of different sort of parts of this question that are all linked together? There's definitely some mathematical bits, But also I'm looking to see how you think based upon this graph. And I'll just give you a very quick other example. This is more on the kind of natural sciences side, but I would present this diagram to students. Again, this is an old question, you won't get this anymore. And I'd say to students, okay, look, what do you see in this diagram? And they're actually snails. And I'd ask them if they thought that there was one species or many. And that's an interesting question, because some students say, oh, they're all different, so there's lots of species. Other people would say, no, one. And then I would say, okay, so there is one species. Why is that unusual? The question is really, why have so many different forms of the same species? Especially as you know what Darwin said about natural selection.
Someone says they may have similar phylogeny.
Phylogeny.
Sorry, I'm not a natural scientist.
Not quite. It's actually to do with predation. So it's one species, lots of different forms. Can you think of any advantages or any ways in which you can actually get all of these different forms being maintained by natural selection? Because normally natural selection would wipe out all of the less fit forms. So how can you explain this particular situation?
Someone says they may be in different locations. Somebody else says...
It's a good answer. It's not that.
Somebody else says different habitats.
It's a good
Somebody
answer. It's
else
not that.
says they live in an autumnal environment, i.e. the best adaptation is to have varying colours across the population. And somebody else says perhaps they were all raised in different environments or conditions, but then you wouldn't expect every single one to be raised in a different place. Somebody else...
These are all good answers. It's not the right answer though. So these are
someone says divergent evolution. Someone says if they are all similar colours and due to that the colours they are able to hide from predators even though they are similar. Someone else says different age.
Possibilities, all possibilities. Now, if I tell you that, so I'll give you a
how
bit
much
of extra
nutrition? Sorry, to do with nutrition or sunlight.
No one's got it yet. So if I tell you that these are eaten by birds, and crows probably will eat some of them as well. Now, the ability of a bird to find a snail is quite strongly correlated to its frequency. So if a bird doesn't encounter a particular form, a particular morph, as we call it, very frequently, it's not very good at finding them. Whereas if it finds a particular color or particular banding pattern, if they're quite common, the birds will find them and eat them a lot more frequently. So does that tell you how these forms are maintained?
Someone says colors that predators may not see. Like, for instance, dogs not being able to see that yellowish colour.
That's probably from before I just gave you this hint, but that's part of it. But can you think of why you might get a situation like this?
Same colours are eradicated. Due to the variation, it allows them to prevent the association from birds.
One way to think about this is if you were a kind of mummy snail, and you were if you had a choice, theoretically, that you were going to give birth to a particular form, what form would you want to give birth to? Which type of snail would you want to give birth to? Any idea? If you could choose any of these forms, or any form in the population, which one would be the most advantageous?
Someone says an unusual or uncommon one. Somebody else says one with a gene for a bigger shell for more protection or shade.
So the first answer was absolutely right. You would want to give birth to a rare form. And so each snail actually has an advantage if it's rare. Okay. And that means that each form, if it's rare, will do very well. Now, of course, what happens then? So if a rare form does well, it starts to increase. What happens? Then as it becomes more common, it does less and less well. And so its benefit starts to drop until actually, if it's really common, it may be disadvantaged. And so what this means is that rare forms have an advantage, common forms have a disadvantage, and that leads to what we call an evolutionarily stable equilibrium, where you have all of these different forms, and if any one becomes too common, it drops down again, and if any one becomes too rare, it increases again. And that can lead to an evolutionarily stable equilibrium. Okay, so this is quite advanced stuff. This is now talking about things like game theory. Now, here's a final question before I answer your questions. This situation actually can apply to us, where we have an evolutionarily stable equilibrium between forms. Can you think of a situation that applies to all populations of humans all over the world, where there is one of these evolutionarily stable equilibrium, where you've got two forms maintained in real balance in the population, and that balance is at 50% of one form and 50% of the other? And of course, the answer is, I'll just come straight to the answer. The answer is, of course, the sex ratio in humans. So the sex ratio in humans and in many other animals is maintained by this process. Because with the sexes, if one sex becomes more too common or far more common, it has a disadvantage because there's less of the other sex. If one sex becomes rare, that has an advantage. So you get this equilibrium, which means that in most species and most animals, you find a 50-50 sex ratio at birth, because it's at that point where the sex ratio is evolutionarily stable. That's why you find 50-50 males and females. This is in terms of sex at birth across the animal kingdom. Okay. So that's one question. And again, we're delving into the depths of real sort of biology in this sense. So that hopefully gives you an idea of the kind of things that we look for in interviews. These thinking skills, these abilities to apply knowledge to solve these kind of puzzle type problems. And in science, in engineering, in mathematics, you will be asked these types of puzzles. Just to give you an example of another question that was asked a few years ago. So in computer science, I remember very distinctly a question which was about frogs hopping across lily pads, and they could move, they could jump one or two lily pads ahead. And the question was basically about algorithms, about whether you could create a mathematical construct to show how many, what the kind of the typical number of hops across a pond might be based upon these basic rules. And so, again, that's a situation where you have to create a kind of mathematical technique for explaining what you see. But it's, again, based on something we give you, where you have to apply what you know to come up with an answer using your understanding and your thinking skill. Okay. So I'll finish there. We'll come to some questions now. Just my final points, though, just to make it clear, like what advice I would give you for interviews. The first thing I would say is that it's okay to get things wrong. That's absolutely fine. The second thing I would say is listen, because your interviewers can give you guidance and can point you on the right track. That's really, really important. The third thing I would say is it is important to talk and to get some practice. And you can get practice just by talking about your subject with members of your family, with your friends, with your teachers. Just practice talking out loud about what you're thinking in relation to a subject. The reason I say that is as we go through an interview, we will be giving you hints, and to understand where you've gone wrong or what hints we can give you, it's really helpful if you talk us through what you're thinking. And that enables us to see your thought processes and to give you guidance. If you just sit there and just think about it for 10 minutes, we can't give you very useful guidance. So get used to talking, get used to talking out loud, get used to saying what's going through your mind so that we can give you some pointers. Those are my 3 things. A fourth thing may be make sure you know what's in your personal statement. I think Lindsay's probably mentioned this because there is a possibility we might ask you a quick question about this at the start. And if you don't know anything about things you said you know, it can look quite bad. So just make sure you are familiar with your personal statement before you do it. But for the most part in the sciences, we will ask you questions about other subjects, about objects, graphs, equations, and so on. Good, right, Lindsay, hit me with some questions.
Okay, there's quite a few. Is there anywhere online that we can find sample admissions questions for maths?
Now, for maths, it's different. So there is a place that, so if you just Google admissions assessments Cambridge, I think you'll come to a site which has got pretty much all of the past admissions assessments for all subjects. But maths is assessed using a step paper. Okay, sorry, did you say, was it admissions assessment questions? Was it?
For sample admissions questions.
Admissions question, okay. So
I'm thinking it's to do with interviews.
Sorry, I thought you were talking about assessments there. The one thing you can do is for maths, we will be doing some course specific guidance sessions later on in the year. So we will be having a maths interview.
Oh, Paul, you're muted. Can't hear you. Paul was saying,
that?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, typical thing, unplug it, plug it back in. So, so I'm just trying to think if there is anything online. There is a book which our maths admissions tutor, sorry, our maths director studies always recommend. But I think it's on the website under the maths admissions section. If you can't find it on the maths website, email Lindsay, and I will find that book for you. It's a really popular kind of maths puzzle book, which has got a lot of the types of questions which we ask. And it will give you a kind of idea of the kind of the particular types of skills that we look for in our mathematicians. Okay, they're kind of, your typical maths puzzles, but just quite tough. So, okay. Sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, but email Lindsay and I'll see if I can dig it out.
Fine. What would be an example of an incorrect line of argument? For instance, i.e. due to lack of listening.
So just like when I was talking about the chessboard, and people said 64, and that's it's fine. That's what most people say. If I was starting to push on 2x2 squares and 3x3, if students didn't pick up on the fact that there were bigger squares, that would probably be an issue. With the snails, I mentioned about predation and about moving it to a different area. If students were to continue to keep on talking about genetics, for instance, or things like which genetics does explain it in some ways, but not in the way I was looking for. But if they were to continue not taking that information on board, it wouldn't get them to the right kind of answer. So those are the kind of the wrong lines of argument. They're not, you can't really be initially wrong on those questions because you're answering part of it. But it's once we give you the guidance, you don't listen, and you keep on going with what you were thinking about before, then you can be wrong. So, and often we might have to repeat things a few times anyway. So, we'd probably give you the hint again at that point.
Okay, thank you. How would each of the criteria, for instance, interest and aptitude, be assessed with that chessboard question? And somebody else asked the same question, but for how would that be assessed? Where is it? Well, same question, but for something else. And one of the other things you looked at, I guess it's probably the same response anyway for both. So how would each of the criteria?
So for those ones, it's difficult to judge interest, but the way in which the student approaches the question often shows sort of how motivated they are. Again, we can't judge enthusiasm. It's not one of those things because some people will be really quiet. Interest is one of those difficult things. But what we are certainly assessing in each of these questions is really your thinking skills more than the interest. The interest stuff, I suppose, might come in if we ask you a very brief question about your personal statement. That's more likely to flag up what interests you more. Often as well, something else that brings in interest is how much you bring outside information well. So often when I've asked the one about the snails, students have said something, they've sort of said, oh, I've heard something like this before in this situation. And that shows me that they've actually been doing reading and research, and that clearly they enjoy actually doing that kind of background information. So occasionally you may be able to show off something similar that you've read through background reading that can enhance your answer. But interest is different from motivation. Sorry, interest is different from enthusiasm. So interest, it's more about how we can pick up on, what you might have read around and how you bring in additional ideas into the argument.
The next question is, will the physics and engineering questions be more calculation heavy?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. They absolutely will. So some of them might still be discursive, but maths is absolutely critical for physical, natural sciences and engineering. And we at Homerton often, it's still open to debate, but if we're doing it online, we allow people to use a whiteboard. If it was in person, there would be paper on the table in front of you. And actually, we would hope that you would write down your answers so we can spot how you calculate things. And we can see errors in your calculations there. So for the mathematical ones, there would be a lot more calculations and a lot more mapping things out. I just didn't go into too much detail about those ones because I may lose some of the audience for those ones. Because they do get very specific. But if you want to hear more about those, come online later on in the year and see our specific preparation for physical, natural sciences and mathematics and for engineering. I'm pretty certain we'll have guidance sessions on all of those, which talk about the subjects at Cambridge, but we'll also have specific interview questions for each of those subjects. I've just committed to doing all of those. We were planning on doing all of them.
That is our subject focus sessions that you can look out for. Somebody says, why would it be a crow? I don't know if you want to tackle that question.
I didn't go into that. So it's about the right size and mass for a crow but also it's got a very big brain for its body. And so basically what I was looking for is someone to say, if there's a bird that has got a bird that might have a big brain, I might do something using a brain that would be particularly unusual. And you may know if you don't get it's a crow, that's absolutely fine. But I was looking to see if she'd come up with something that wasn't a mammal that has a big brain and get something roughly the right size. That's really what I was looking for that.
Okay. Will we be given rough paper and a pen for the interview? And then are we allowed calculators?
Our Homerton, if you're doing it in person, yes. If you're doing it online, you should have it in front of you, yes, and you can just in case. I don't think we prevent you using calculators, but most of the time we're not interested in actually the bits you put into calculators. It's about the equations and the way that you do the calculation rather than the actual result as such. So even sometimes if a student writes if they write down the right equation, that's me sorted. I don't need them to actually put it into a calculator. So you can have a calculator, but it's unlikely that you will use it. It's more about you writing out the equations, put it bluntly.
Okay. How much maths knowledge do you need above GCSE for the interview?
Well, it depends which subject you're applying for. Now, most of our interviews should be largely based on GCSE or equivalent, but they may touch upon certain materials from early A-level or IB or equivalent. What you should do is, to get an idea of what we're expecting of you, look at the specification for the admissions assessments. And this year, the science admissions assessment is changing a little bit in terms of structure to something called the ESAT. But you can look, the fundamental questions are not changing though, and they've been written by the same team that has done the previous one. So you can look back at the past questions, but also look back at the specifications for these tests, which you can find online. The specification is a document that summarizes everything you know for these assessments. It's everything you need to know for these assessments. If you look at those, that's the kind of thing we're looking for interviews as well. And it's largely GCSE, but there will be some early A-level material there. The stuff that everyone will almost certainly have done by the time they get to interview.
Thank you. There's 2 questions that are about medicine.
Yeah.
Are there any example questions for medicine interviews? And the other question is, how much of this applies to medical interviews? Is it a mixture between STEM and humanities, or should I seek out other resources for that?
Good question. So at Homerton, again, it's exactly what the student mentioned. It's a mixture. So you will have a science-based interview because our medical tripos is very scientific. You know, in the 3rd year, most students will take basically a 3rd year from the natural sciences course. They'll do the 3rd year natural sciences course. The whole point of our medical tripos is to produce really great medical scientists, really. And so there will be a strong science focus, but we also want students who are going to be able to cope with patients. So there will be questions in one of the interviews about things like ethics and patient treatment. Okay, we have to ask those questions because if we are going to admit you to be a doctor who may work on people, it's part of it. And so you can look at those. If you look at any broad book about medical interviews, you can see the types of things that we will ask. Okay, and it's often a situation, how you deal with a particular medical situation, and sometimes the ethics of certain situations. But most medical preparation textbooks will give you supportive advice for those types of questions. But on top of that, you'll also get some science questions, a bit like the ones I've just gone through just now.
Thank you. Do you get to ask the STEM interviewer a question? And if so, do you prefer being asked questions or do you prefer none at all?
I prefer none at all, I'll be honest with you. So we often say at the end, have you got any questions? And if sometimes the student may ask for clarification, a bit like the student did about the whether it was okay to say with the Chrome, that's absolutely fine. And that otherwise you'll be going stir crazy trying to work out what it was. And so that's fine. Those types of questions are okay. But I wouldn't ask the question, something along the lines of, what aspects of your research do you love the most, which I have been asked before. Because at the end of the day, it really doesn't have a bearing on your performance. You're not gonna, it's not really related. It doesn't relate to how you've done in the assessment. So ask questions that clarify any aspects of the admission process or some about things that you've been asked in the interview, but don't worry about asking more kind of superfluous things about the interviewer and their history, because it won't benefit you at all.
Okay, thank you. Someone says, so are you marked on your critical and creative thinking skills rather than the actual answer itself?
So, but both. So it is about, you'll get to the answer eventually using all of your critical and synthetic skills. So if you get to the end of the question, yes, it is about getting to the answer, but we are looking at how you think and how you get to the answer as well. That's just as important. Okay, so even if if I ask a question, the student gives me the right answer straight away, I will still push them to find out how they got to that answer. Because there's always going to be a worry that the student just learned it and is just regurgitating it and remembering it. You've got to be able to explain the answer as well as getting to it.
Thank you. Will the 2 interviewers necessarily both be from your subject? For example, for engineering, will they both be engineering, or could one be from physics?
It depends on our on who we've got available. So we have loads of fellows. So occasionally for engineering, we have drawn upon, for instance, mathematics fellows who will ask some applied mathematics questions, or for medicine, we might draw upon our chemist fellow. And so we do use some fellows for subjects which they don't normally teach, but they will generally be experts in the subject. So they will be well versed to ask the questions that you're asking. But don't worry, we're still going to be testing things that you should have done in your A levels or IB or whatever, and we're going to be pushing you beyond in the same way across all of the interviews. So, for instance, some of the engineering interviews will be quite similar to the physical and natural sciences ones, but not all of it. So there'll be some questions in engineering that you'd never be asked in physical and natural science. So it depends. And don't forget, you'll get 4 interviewers, each of which will ask normally different types of questions.
Thanks. Just to let you know, there's 18 questions more at the minute.
Okay.
What is the difference between the questions asked in admissions tests and the questions asked in the interview?
Oh, massive difference. So in the admissions assessments, they are generally multiple choice now. They still require you to think and to process different bits of information, but remember that the interview ones are far more discursive, far more, they're far more flexible, and we can give you guidance. Okay. Some of them might seem superficially similar in terms of calculations, but the interview ones will often be more in depth and be based upon the ability of us to give you guidance to get to put together different ideas.
Do all STEM interviews follow the same structure? For instance, starting with your personal statement and then going on to harder questions?
Not always.
Another question.
I mentioned the personal statement because we generally don't at Homerton do that, but other colleges do, I know, and it's normally only briefly at the start of an interview.
Okay, there was a similar question, which was, do the interview questions progressively get harder?
Yes. Normally. Another thing to note about interviews is we'll never say, and this is worth remembering, we'll never say, right, you've answered all my questions, well done, we'll stop there. We will never say that, okay? Our questions can go on indefinitely. We have to do that. We have to have questions which we can take on, because sometimes a student might answer, the first few questions in 2 minutes, another student might do it in 10. And so we will interview you for a particular time. So our questions will often be pretty much open-ended, and we will keep going. And that will mean that we will never run out of questions, but we will always get to the end point and say, right, we're out of time. So we will stop there. That's not bad. That doesn't mean that you failed in some way. What that means is we literally have run out of time. We've got through a number of questions. You will never know how far you got through them, generally speaking. But that bit at the end where we say, okay, let's finish there, we've run out of time, that happens in almost every interview. Don't let it worry you, that's perfectly normal. And it's not a failure. It doesn't mean you haven't got to the end of the question, because our questions will keep on going. And they generally do get harder as the time goes on, as you have to bring together different bits.
Okay. How do you judge how interested someone is based on their supercurricular, and what supercurricular should I use if I want to do engineering?
Well, this is broader, isn't it, about the application itself? But the same thing with all supercurricular stuff. It's things like Olympiads, competition, anything you do which shows that you are really thinking about the subject is great. So, for instance, some of you doing engineering might want to participate in our design competition for sustainability, which we're opening soon, I think, aren't we, Lindsay?
Yes, it is open.
Oh, it's open already.
Yeah, until the 1st of May.
Yeah. That shows you're willing to go out there on a team, do a project, come up with a great engineering design to solve a problem in sustainability. Others of you may want to participate in our biology competition that we're running at the moment as well. So we have a biology championship, which you have to answer a question every month or so. Just going to participate in competitions is fine. Other things you can do are just like, might be reading books and watching videos, but they're a little bit more passive. But anything that shows that you love the subject in your personal statement is great. Okay. That's a bit away from it. Yeah.
For medical interviews, would you recommend practicing analysing graphs and doing wider reading?
For graphic analysis, I would say for most interviews that will be handy in some way. So yes, get used to practice and explain what they are. Wider reading, it could be a hit and miss. I mean, it's unlikely that you'll touch upon exactly the question that we're going to ask, because that would be very fluky. But with that wider reading, it may just give you some points in the interview where you can draw upon a bit more information. So it's always a good thing to do. but don't bank on us asking you a question about exactly the thing that you've read. But it may be something you can draw into a question later on.
What's the difference between a maths interview, physics and engineering, besides them discussing different topics?
So physics and engineering, they will be a lot more applied. Our mathematics questions will be a lot purer in nature, so they'll be more theoretical. They're all hard, I won't lie to you, because maths at Cambridge, this is Cambridge, Sir Isaac Newton came to Cambridge, who pretty much founded modern mathematics and its teaching. So the maths questions are tough, particularly in maths interview. In engineering and physical natural sciences, they will be more applied. Also, if you're applying for physical natural sciences, you're probably also going to get asked some chemistry questions as well, almost certainly, if you're doing chemistry. But basically, physics, engineering, the basic premise is is about understanding problems. It might be about mass, it might be about electrical currents, it might be about structures, mass balancing, the distribution of mass, the weights and forces over diagrams is a very common one in both physics and engineering. But the maths is the more different one because it's often more theoretical and pure puzzles as opposed to the same applied ones.
Does Cambridge give an interview score out of 10? How is this assessed? For example, what's the real difference between a 6 and a 7?
Ooh. So that's an interesting question. So the summaries we have are basically sort of like, having whether you had a satisfactory performance, whether you had a possibly worth an offer, whether it was I'm trying to think, I've got anything from around actually. I'm not sure if I have. I might have a blank one somewhere. I've got one in front of me. But basically it's the kind of thing like satisfactory, good, excellent. It's that kind of level of scale. And so there's 4 interviewers, each of which will give you this kind of score. And if you've got good or excellence in some, then then that's pretty good. If it's excellence across the board, then that does increase the chances of an offer dramatically. Okay, so I mean, people rarely get the kind of really absolutely top marks, and most students will be in the kind of average, satisfactory area, with some being good and excellent, and it's about how you do across those goods and excellence. It takes our decision.
Would you say Bloom's taxonomy for thinking is the main criteria used to assess STEM candidate? If not, then what is?
So I use that because it's something that your teachers at school get taught, and it's a nice summary of the different types of thinking. So I use that. Most interviews will not use that explicitly, but we are certainly looking for these types of thinking skills. And so we will write down information as well, and often we can say, put together ideas really well, or use some really great lateral concepts and synthesize them. And so these are constantly things, not necessarily explicitly that we look for, but which we do absolutely use. So we don't certainly go down Bloom's taxonomy to things. No, it's not that. But we might say has an excellent understanding of this thing, or an excellent analyze the graph really well. That kind of stuff might be a comment.
Okay. How hard are the questions? Are they similar to ones that you'd see in Olympiads?
In some senses, yes. But, and it's difficult to sort of say, because you are being put on the spot. So they're perhaps the early ones we like to warm you up. So the early ones shouldn't be too bad. And hopefully, ideally, they would let you in to a kind of soft start, really. And then they will get harder. But it's difficult to judge compared to Olympiad because you are doing them, you're doing them on your own in front of a person. So that does place increased pressure. So there'll be some similarities, but they will have this flexibility for us to give you guidance as you progress.
Okay. Would you assess these aspects of thinking when reading a STEM application? I'm not sure what that was referring to, so we could skip that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to judge that in the application itself.
How far would you say the interview can be prepared for, and what websites or resources help you to prepare?
So it's difficult to prepare for the questions, like, you know, because you won't know. I mean, every year I make up my questions, like new questions, often a few days before I start interviewing, and so you won't know. But what you can do is practice talking through how you think about science with your parents, with your friends, with your teachers. That is something you can practice, and practice talking out loud so that we can give you the guidance that you need. So that's the thing that you can practice, talking about the subject, not necessarily preparing for the exact question that you get.
If you want to do chemistry at Cambridge, is there a chemical natural sciences? I've only seen biological and physical on the website.
No, it's a bit weird, I know. So basically, most chemists apply down the physical sciences route. Some occasionally apply down the biological sciences route if they want to do like biochemistry. I'd recommend probably applying down the physical route then, because then you'll get questions focused on physics, chemistry, and maths. I think that's what we advise centrally, to apply down the physics. But if you want to be a pure chemist, it just means that you'll be more likely to get questions that suit you a bit more directly.
I think this is linked. How would the interview split if you want to do natural sciences in physics, chemistry, and earth sciences?
It depends on the college that you're applying to. So I'm really talking about Homerton here. But if you wanted to do those subjects, I mean, we would give you a kind of physicsy question. Would we give you an earth sciences one? Sometimes we can't guarantee that we'll give you an earth sciences question. But there'll certainly be normally one mainly physics-based interview and one interview based more on maths if you're applying to the more physics route. That's what I would say. If you're applying to physics, there'd be one applied maths and physics and one which will be more mathematical and perhaps a little bit less applied.
Okay, how do you differentiate between mathematical thinking for a maths degree or for a computer science degree?
It's very similar at Cambridge because our computer science degree is very, very mathematical. It's probably one of the most mathematical computer science courses in the world. And so there are a lot of similarities in terms of the types of thinking that we're looking for. The big difference is that for the computer science application, we actually have an assessment which is done before you apply. I think the deadline is the 16th of September. You have to do that. So you have to register, then you apply, then you do the assessment, which I know is a bit weird again. For maths, the assessment is after we've decided to make you an offer, and that's STEP, and that happens later in the year at about the same time as your A-level. But the questions at interview will be quite similar in many cases because the two courses do have a lot of maths in them.
Okay. Do the questions asked by each interviewer follow on from each other?
Often, I mean, they can sometimes go at a bit of a tangent, but I mean, many of my colleagues and myself do like to have a structure to the question because it enables us to test that ability to synthesize information. If they're all completely different things, you can't do that.
Will the change to the ESAT affect the other aspects of the process? For instance, the questions asked in the interview or how the personal statement is assessed?
So the change to the ESAT, it's largely structural. So now you're doing 3 sections, each of 40 minutes. But just to reiterate that the questions will be very similar to those that came up in the past. And I know that the same team has been involved. Not necessarily the same people, the same organisation has been involved in creating the questions, so it shouldn't be too different. But overall, it still sits in the same position about how we use it. So we'll use it to decide who to interview partly, although at Homerton we interview most students for sciences. But if you do really, really badly in these assessments, then we might not invite you to interview. That's like really badly. But most of the students we do it right. So we use it as part of that, and then also to help in our decision making.
Somebody else says, does every applicant for a subject get the same interview questions? Are similar interview questions asked each year?
No.
And I guess similar question, is each interview catered to the individual to test if what they said in their personal statement was true?
So it depends. Like occasionally you'll get it depends on the college, but sometimes you might be asked a very quick question about your personal statement, just to check your knowledge. And it's often just to warm you up because we want you to talk on familiar territory for the first few minutes to get you going, to make it easy on you. So that's the main reason for talking about your personal statement, to be honest. It doesn't give us huge amounts of comparative information, getting you to talk about things that you should know about. Okay. The questions though do change. So questions are pretty dead after about a day. So I often write 3 or 4 sets of questions, and many interviewers do, because we tell students not to distribute our questions afterwards, but just to make sure we often ask different questions on each day. So don't think you can just talk to one of your mates who's just been interviewed and get the same question, because there's a good chance it will be a different one.
Okay.
And sometimes if I do use bits of a previous question, I will tweak it so that the answer's different.
Do you look at the workings in the admissions tests or just the final mark?
The admissions tests, we just look at the final mark. Workings in interview are important.
The example questions we did today were really fun. Would you say those were examples of easier STEM interview questions or harder ones?
They're real ones. They are probably, I wouldn't say they were easier, but remember I did talk you through them. So I didn't actually interview everyone list. So if you'd have been sitting there without me guiding you through them, think how difficult they would have been. So just bear that in mind. So students have had lots of trouble with those questions before. So they're not maybe as easy or as they might seem initially.
Does getting through more questions necessarily equal a better interview?
It's one of the metrics that can give us an indication of how well you're doing. So, for instance, if you get onto the really advanced question, it probably means that you've breezed through the early ones. And so it does give us but again, you won't generally know that. And we're very careful not to let you know how far you've got through.
Okay. What makes an interview excellent compared to good or satisfactory?
Well, I mean, people can shine in so many different ways. That's the thing. So some students can show real moments of amazing insight where everything just clicks together. You can always see it like the sort of different little links being made. So that to me is a really good interview. Some students have just got have got incredible knowledge and understanding, and some it's a good interview for me is really just a nice discussion about a topic, where it's kind of free flowing and it's kind of you're backwards and forwards, and it's kind of it doesn't feel like an interview. Actually, it feels more like a discussion. The best interviews for me are the ones that don't feel like interviews.
Okay. Is it good or bad if you've given lots of ideas and thought processes about a question but not a definite answer?
It's okay, but bear in mind that if you spend too long doing that, often you might be going off at tangents, and often students can go really far away from the question. So the interview will often try to bring you back. So you don't want to go too tangentially because effectively you're avoiding the question, which occasionally does happen. So students do have a tendency to tell us what they think we want or what they want to tell us rather than what we've actually asked them. So that does happen, the kind of distraction, So I ask a question, I get something completely different back because the student wants to tell me about something they just read. And so it really is important that you answer the interview question that they are.
The next question. There's 2 left.
2 left. Oh, we're getting better.
2 left. Hopefully no one submits anymore.
Don't say that. Everyone's going to do it now. Yeah.
Do different colleges differ in interview styles for the same course? Is there a website that summarizes how each college styles their interview for a course?
So we all, a lot of the other interviewers, and we all know each other, and we often interview alongside each other, for instance. So for instance, I will interview, if you were applying for biological natural sciences at Homerton, I would be interviewing you, but I also interview for another college. I won't tell you which one, but I interview for another college. And so sometimes there's a lot of overlap. And many of the interviewers, we've all had training in the ways to do it. I mean, I give lots of the training about how to interview. So we've all had that kind of training and guidance. And so we'll often all follow the same principles in doing that, about how to get the best out of students. So many of the things will be similar, but you won't often find specific information about exactly how it's going to go, because, like, for instance, sometimes different students may be interviewed by different people at the same college, even at the same college. For some subjects, we have huge numbers of applicants, and that means that we have to have a whole team of interviewers working together. But they'll often run their questions past each other and work out how to compare people.
Thank you. What would be alternative to further maths for natural sciences? Is this essential?
Further maths is really, really useful for physical natural sciences. It's far from essential in biology. And in fact, probably the majority of students for biological natural sciences don't have it. But if you are thinking about physics, this is a bit off topic, but if you are thinking about physical natural sciences, the more maths experience you can get, the better. Really. I don't think it's obligatory yet. I'm pretty certain it's not. But the more maths experience you can get, the better, because there's loads of maths on our courses. It's really, really mathematical. Really mathematical. So you have to, you've got to be comfortable with maths. So the more maths experience you've got, the better. It's also important because you have to do a maths section in the ESAT. The first section is maths, so you have to do maths. So that often, the more maths experience you have, the better you'll do at that section generally.
Okay, there's now a final question.
This is the final one now.
Yeah. Do you get a chance to talk freely about something you want to talk about, or are you only allowed to respond to the interviewer's questions?
So this is the thing. So we sometimes give you the opportunity for a little bit at the start, if we were asking you about your personal perspective. The problem is about talking freely is that it's very difficult for us to compare students when they're talking about subjects that they really should know about anyway. Okay, because students can prepare that, and if that was allowed, students could just prepare a kind of a summary and come in with it, or someone else can prepare it. So it would be very difficult to assess. Sometimes, questions get really broad, where we might ask you to draw in an example from something completely, really quite broad. So you might be able to draw in some of your things there, but it's very rare that we give you an opportunity to talk absolutely freely, because it just would be so difficult to assess. I think that's really the key thing. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Yeah. It would be really difficult to assess completely free speech, because we wouldn't be able to tell if it was yours for a start, but also it'd be so over prepared as well. We're looking at how you reply to what we give you.
So we've come to the end of our STEM interview session. Thank you so much for joining. I think if you don't have anything else to add, Paul, then we can end here.
I should say as well that interviews will never overrun by this much either. So yeah, we'll always stop at the time. So this is unusual in this sense. So yeah, but thank you for sticking around, everyone, and answering questions.
Oh, there's a final. Thank you so much. This was really useful. Thank you.
Okay. Good stuff, everyone.
Okay, thank you, and I'll end here. Thanks,
Take care,
Paul.
Bye-bye.